Good morning, church. Isn't it a beautiful day here in South Texas? I want to thank all of you who came out this morning. I know it's freezing. I know it's cold. I know that it's messy, but I appreciate all y'all coming out. And all of you who are joining us online, I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. So as many of you know, I had the pleasure and the privilege when I got out of the United States Army to work with civilian EMS and to work on an ambulance. And I've talked about the differences there. Of course, one of the biggest differences, my ambulance in the United States Army could roll through this building, had a grenade launcher on it. It was a lot of fun. It was up-armored. It could be hit by a pretty heavy bomb and still keep going. But, in the civilian world, they don't give you ambulances like that. In fact, you have a lot less protection. And I remember when I was working for Edinburgh EMS there, and we were working 911. And I remember one day, the partner I had been assigned to, I hadn't been there at the company for very long, but the partner I had been assigned to, we were sitting in the truck, and he looked at me and he said, "Partner, I want you to understand something very clearly. I've got your back, unless there are dogs. And then it's every man for himself. So you better be fast. Because I don't have to outrun the dog, I just have to outrun you." Now, I was probably about 23 years old at the time, pretty fresh out of the Army, and my partner was much older than me, and he was a larger gentleman. And so when he said that, I just kind of looked at him and was like, okay, I think I'm going to win that foot race. He saw the look. He just looked. He said, "We'll see what happens." I said, "I guess we will." So off we were, and we worked a couple of shifts together, and it had kind of fallen to the back of my mind. I'd kind of forgotten about it. And we got a call, it was late at night, and we were walking up to the house. So we arrived on scene, we had the stretcher out, and we were walking up to the house, and I had the stretcher, and I was in the lead, and my partner was behind me, when all of a sudden, we heard the most ferocious barking you could ever possibly imagine, or at least it sounded like that in the middle of the night, at this strange house that I was at. And both of us immediately, danger senses went crazy. And so I turned to run. He threw the stretcher in front of me, tripped me up, and was in the ambulance before I knew what was going on. What I learned that day, things are not always as they appear. Christ said something that I'm sure caught his disciples, in fact, I know it did, it caught his disciples off guard quite a bit. When he called them all together and he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be the first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." You see, the scriptures make it clear that the chief among us, the greatest among us, will always be our servant. As Christ, who is the head of our church, who is the leader of our church himself, came and died and sacrificed himself for us. In fact, Christ will constantly go back to this and say, look, if you want to be my disciple, you have to pick up the cross and follow me. Christianity is not about who is the greatest. Christianity is about who is willing to serve his brother or sister. So how often do we view service and submission as our path to success in his kingdom, in the church, or in our own lives and relationships? The purpose of the sermon this morning, then, is to examine the role of submission, specifically in marriage, so that we as disciples of Christ are encouraged to lead lives that are pleasing to our Father. To do this, we're going to continue our examination of Ephesians. We're in chapter 5. We're going to continue to look at verses 5:21 through 33. We're not going to look at all of that today. However, we're going to focus in on chapter 5:21 through verse 24. So let's go ahead and get into that. So Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, we've been looking at this for a while now. It says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, we've looked at submission. We've spent all last week looking at submission, and we used the example of Obadiah as godly submission. And so godly submission is willingly placing yourself under someone else's authority, while worldly submission has in mind this idea that you're going to be forced, that a greater power or greater authority forces you into this position. Rather, godly submission is this willingness to put yourself under somebody's authority. And we saw this very clearly with Obadiah last week when we looked at Obadiah and he followed Ahab. Remember, Ahab was a wicked king of Israel who did horrible things, not the least of which was kill prophets of the Lord. So we saw Obadiah. Husbands and wives are one flesh. Therefore, let what God has joined, let not man separate. The reality is, when Paul is looking at the wife and saying, wife, submit to your husbands, you are submitting to yourself in reality. But what is that submission? I mean, what is it? It says submit. We have an idea, a cultural idea of what that submission is. I submit to you. Gosh, there's a lot of submitting going on here. I submit to you now that this submission, this is going to get confusing pretty quick, guys. I would say to you this: the submission that is being called for here is not slavery. Rather, it is a willingly putting yourself under that of your husband. That's what this is talking about. Now, if that sounds kind of vague, I'm sorry. Because that's at the end, that's what it is. If we go and we look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33, Paul makes it clear, husbands, you are to love your wives, and wives, you are to respect your husbands. So the end of this submission should be respect. But that's going to look different in every marriage. The way my wife submits to me might be different from the way another husband would expect his wife to submit to him. What I am telling you is there are a lot of variations as to what this can look like in a marriage. One husband might expect a wife to have no questions. A wife might be fine with that. That might be how that looks like in that marriage. And is that acceptable? Well, it's their marriage. What the wife is doing here is giving the husband what he needs. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in verse 23. But what we have to understand is this isn't looking at the wife saying she's not capable, she's stupid, or any other foolish thing. The reality is this is looking at the wife and it's saying, for the good of your husband, this is what needs to happen. And in a little bit, Paul's going to look at the husband and he's going to say, for the good of your wife, this is what needs to happen. As many of you know, I've only been in the church for about 4 years. And prior to that, and I've made no secret of this, my wife and I, our relationship was horrible. There were many times that both of us had considered divorce. It was something where they talk about when we do marital counseling, we often talk about a love bank. It's this idea of the person feeling loved and acting out of feeling loved versus the person acting out of not feeling loved. The reality is for both of us, our love bank was empty. And our love bank was empty because we were both trying to love each other the wrong way. In our marriage, I desired respect. And one of the things I would constantly tell her is I don't feel respected. My wife would tell me she wants to be loved. And yet, no matter how hard I tried, she did not feel loved. Because I was trying to give my wife respect, while my wife was trying to tell me how much she loved me. Now, I could ask, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I could ask men, if you think your wife loves you, raise your hand. And most men in this room would probably raise their hand. We're fully aware that our wives love us. They stick with us. That speaks volumes. But if I were to ask the same men, does your wife respect you? I imagine I would see a lot of hands go down. And I know 4 years ago, that was certainly the case for me. When Paul looks at the wife and says, submit to your husband, it's not because the woman is incapable. It's because this is what the husband will need. In verse 23, he continues, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is head of the church, his body of which he is the Savior. Notice the why of the respect in this verse. Your husband is the head. Again, you are one flesh. That's the reality here. We are one flesh, and the husband is the head of the wife. It's just that simple, just like Christ is the head of the church. The reality is your husband is a part of you. Does it do you any good to despise yourself? Wives, would it make any sense for you to get up in the morning and leave your head behind in bed? Does anybody do that? Or who would look at their own foot and curse it? Who does that? The reality is we are one flesh. It doesn't make any sense to despise yourself or slander yourself. The reality is when we behave that way, when we refuse to submit, the reality is that's what we're telling our husband. And as Christ is the head of the church, this is incredibly important to understand. We don't look at Christ, who is the head of our church, and go, yeah, I don't care what you have to say. Who does that? Who gets up? Who from here, I want to know, who from here would walk out of here and say, Christ, yeah, you're God, but I'm going to do whatever I want to do? Wouldn't that be incredibly foolish? Especially considering the sacrifices that He has made, that Christ has made on our behalf. The reality is, as head of the church, Christ is incredibly responsible for us. And what has He done for us? Has He not washed us? Has He not redeemed us? Has He not sanctified us? Is He not continually giving us the things we need to mature? Christ is doing everything in His power to take care of us and to deliver us to His Father. In fact, in John chapter 17, He points out that He can't lose. He doesn't want to lose any of us because we've been given to Him by the Father. He is responsible for us, and Christ discharges that responsibility with the utmost care, with the utmost diligence. In a very same way, husbands, we are responsible for our wives. I've said again and again and again, my goal is to one day be on my face before the Father and hear, well done, my good and faithful servant. Husbands, understand, just as Christ is head of the church, and just as He is the Savior, you are head of your family. God is going to hold you to account. He is going to demand an accounting for the way you raised your children and for the way you managed your wife. Because the reality is this: all of us are made in the image of God, are we not? God desires His work, does He not? That's why He sent Christ. Your wife, husbands, hear me on this, your wife is on loan to you. She doesn't belong to you. She belongs to God. And you're going to have to one day give her back to God. What you do with your wife, how you care for her, the spiritual maturity that you seek in yourself and her, all of these things, God is going to have an account, going to hold you to account. Wives, it's the same for you. Your husband does not belong to you. Just like you, he belongs to God. And one day, you're going to have to give him back to God. God is not going to hold you accountable for the way your husband discharged his authority. It's just that simple. He's not. He is going to hold you authority for the things that he has asked you to do. He is going to hold you to account for the submission that he has asked you to give you, that he has asked for you to give your husband. It's just that simple. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Therefore, considering the oneness, the unity we have in marriage, the fact that we really are one flesh, considering the greatest act of love that a woman really could ever give a man is submission, is respect, considering God's possessions in this matter and his expectations in the marital relationship, and considering the role that God would have both husbands and wives play to achieve a union that pleases and respects him. Therefore, wives, submit yourselves. That means willingly place yourself under the authority of your husband. Recognizing the authority of Christ, recognizing the things that Christ has called us to do, recognizing what a godly walk means. Just as the church willingly places itself under the authority of Christ, who has sacrificed for her beyond anything that we could imagine. So going forward, as I've said, I hate to break this section up. I hate to break up Ephesians 5:21 and through 24 from the rest of Ephesians. Because the reality is this is a together thing. We are one flesh. And because we are one flesh, wives submit to their husbands and husbands submit to their wives. It's a mutual submission that brings glory to our Father and achieves one of His most desired outcomes, which is the raising of godly offspring. So I hate to break this section up. That's why this is a part 1, and next week we're going to talk about part 2. We're going to focus in on the husband's submission to the wives. You heard me say that correctly. It is a mutual submission. However, going forward, wives, I want to encourage you. The world says submission is for losers. That's the reality. It makes it clear that submission is for losers and those who are weak. That is not women. In case you have any doubts, God said at the beginning, it is not good for man to be alone, and the way we're going to solve this problem is we're going to give him woman. And God said, you are a helper, but a helper is somebody who brings you water. A helper is somebody who, they kind of contribute to the task, but it's really this person over here doing it. That's not what that word helper means. If you're going to paint a room, gentlemen, you need paint to do it. The woman is paint. You can't get the job done without her. That's what God has in store. He made all of us, man and woman, in the image of God. So women, I want to encourage you, submit to your husbands in everything. And if you have any specific questions about what that looks like or specific circumstances that you're unsure of, I want to encourage you. Ask some of the amazing godly women we have in the audience today. We have women who have been there and done that. You've met your elders. Their wives are some amazing people. They put up with them. Don't fire me. No. But the reality is we have godly examples here. This church is abundantly blessed. This body that meets here is abundantly blessed with a plethora of godly women that we can go and talk to and ask and pick their minds and say, what does this look like? The end goal of submission is respect. How do I get there? What do I need to do? Where am I going wrong? Go to them. Ask. Godly submission is not slavery, but rather the beginning to an abundant, strong marriage and the life we all desire. Get encouragement, get help for our ladies who are not married. Pay close attention, because God's expectation of you is that you do submit to your husband. God's expectation is that you do lead a life of respect for him. So the importance of finding a godly mate cannot be overstated. Again, you will be called to account to God for the way you behaved in your marriage. And I can imagine nothing more difficult than having to place yourself under the authority of a man who is not godly. For all of the ladies out there who were married for many years and now are widows, I want to encourage you. You have great things to contribute to this body. You've seen the race to the end. You know what it means to try to raise godly offspring. You know what it means to contend with a man as he tries to be godly and leads a family. You know things that I know nothing about, and I have nothing to teach. So widows, I want to encourage you, be those teachers. There are plenty of young ladies here who need your help. Be willing to show what it means to be a godly woman. Encourage them, teach them how to lead lives and marriages that glorify God. I've said it again and again and again. I'll probably say it again next week. Submission is an ugly word in our society. But have you noticed how messed up our society is? I don't know about you, but I really wouldn't take anything they say. I wouldn't care what they think of anything. The reality is, Christ said, I came to give you life so that I came to give you life, and that abundantly. Living a life as your own God does not pay. It just doesn't. It leads to misery, it leads to anger, it leads to the dark side of the force. No, I'm just kidding. But it leads to all sorts of bad outcomes. Because the reality is, it's a selfish life, it's a selfish existence. But Christ wants you to know that you can be free if you're willing to submit and follow Him. His gospel is a gospel of freedom. It's a gospel of freedom from slavery. And that slavery is sin and death. All of us in this room, shocking news, are going to die. I know, no one expected that. It's okay. You're going to die, and you're going to stand before God. If you stand before God without Christ, it will be a very bad day. So if you don't have Christ in your life, if you're tired of living in misery, if you're tired of being empty all the time, and you want to be filled, and you want to lead an abundant life, I ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.